Welcome to another episode of Tack Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Jude Russo and Joseph Addington. Today we'll be talking about a few topics, including Russia Ukraine. The Trump administration has presented a peace deal to the Russians and the Ukrainians and said basically that they should accept it or Washington is going to walk away. After we talk about that, we'll talk about the organizational chaos and the Pentagon, or the apparent chaos. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is not having a very good month, and it seems to me, at least, that he's lost control of the department he leads, but we'll see what Joseph and Jude want to say about that. And then Jude will serve as TAC's special Catholic correspondent and talk a little bit about the recent death of Pope Francis. Before we dive in, I want to remind our listeners that there is a video version of this episode that you can watch on YouTube. So please subscribe to the American Conservative on YouTube. Smash that like button. We have to get our numbers up. Links to YouTube are suppressed on X, so it's kind of hard for us to advertise the channel. So please go to our channel, like and subscribe. And if you do, you can see this scratch that I got recently. My 7-month-old daughter, in an act of unprovoked aggression, just scratched me out of nowhere. So I've got a little boo boo, as kids call it. But let's go ahead and dive in with Russia Ukraine. There's been a lot of action on this. It was kind of annoying because I was writing a column and then all this stuff was happening and I kept having to revise and then I filed and then some more stuff happened with this news of Russia Ukraine peace deal that's coming more into the picture. But Jude, can you just kind of fill us in on what's been going on the Russia Ukraine front?
Sure thing. I think the easiest thing to do is look at Vice President Vance's comments to the press in India today. Today is Wednesday, the 23rd. The vice president is in the subcontinent doing the touring, seeing the sights, talking to Modi, and he outlined in very brief what the American proposal is. Basically, what we are saying is Ukraine will recognize the annexation of Crimea. There's a freeze of the status quo line of occupation in the active front, and we take NATO membership permanently off the table. He said if either party isn't cool with that, the United States is just going to walk away. It's a little bit unclear whether that means we are going to stop sending weapons and aid to Ukraine. But at any rate, it does mean that we will no longer actively broker negotiations, which is a point of leverage. Both sides will have more confidence in a peace deal if there is a third party mediating it and invested in its success, especially if that third party is the most powerful nation on the as all this has been going on, Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy for everything, has been flying to and fro. He is set to meet with Putin personally again in Moscow in the coming days. So hopefully there is more to come out of that. For Moscow's part, Putin yesterday, following his unilateral Easter ceasefire, which was observed somewhat in the breach, but still observed. The Yesterday he said that a freezing of the front line is basically what he's looking for, which is to say Ukraine won't cede any territory, including in the contested oblasts, beyond what it's already lost. Russia is not going to pursue a 1918 style referendum in these places, which tends to be how annexations have been handled in the post-war era. He's fine with just sort of ending things where they are, so he says. Zelensky sounds by turns optimistic and kind of unhappy. He said in comments that recognizing Russian ownership of Crimea is a no-go for him. He That said, it's unclear how much leverage he actually has and how much of this is talk to just sort of maximize his position at the negotiating table, um, and how much of it is for domestic consumption and EU consumption. He has to keep his base happy, just like any politician, and I don't think that it's necessarily really to be held against him if he is doing that. So I think that's sort of the 5 minute spiel of where we're at, what's going on.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to that on the details of the Russia-Ukraine peace deal. Since there's been this kind of pushback in Ukraine and in the media about Crimea, it seems like the position now is that the US is saying, well, we'll formally recognize Crimea as belonging to Russia, but Ukraine doesn't have to. That's going to be a recognition that we make. Then there's the de facto recognition, I guess, by the US of these four provinces in eastern Ukraine that Putin claimed to annex in 2022. You already kind of alluded to this. So those are Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And as you said, it's kind of interesting. Putin, and I was really surprised by this. He said that Russia will relinquish the parts of those provinces that they don't control, which he claimed to annex them. So I think most people assumed that he wouldn't relinquish any parts of them because that would seem too politically difficult for him. And Russia will also get sanctions relief and economic cooperation under the terms of this deal. As far as what Ukraine gets, I mean, obviously the media, New York Times, etc., they're criticizing this deal heavily, saying that it favors Russia over Ukraine. Zelensky said that, Russia gets these tangible things, but Ukraine, what it gets is kind of vague. But I'll note that what I found interesting, at least according to reports, is it seems like this deal would have European peacekeepers or Europeans providing some sort of security guarantees to Ukraine, which it's not clear that Putin would accept that. So if he accepts the deal, then presumably he's going to accept that. It also says that Ukraine would be able to join the EU. So it would kind of formalize this pathway to the EU, which, by the way, does have a collective defense agreement. So that too would serve as a kind of security guarantee. Some people in the foreign policy restraint community in America have criticized the idea of giving Ukraine EU membership because they can imagine a scenario in which that means NATO ends up going to war, because a lot of these EU countries are in NATO. But I think it's worth doing, in that it can be negotiated in such a way as to make clear that America wouldn't be responsible. Obviously, there are still risks involved, but I don't think it's a bad idea if Europe is willing to do it. Um, and
I
then
think it's
Ukraine gets some. Go ahead.
I think even for as far as the U.S. is concerned, it is a benefit if this forces the EU to grow up in building its own conventional deterrent.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think it makes sense that the Trump administration would want to put this into the deal. And I think people should acknowledge that this is like a big deal. The reason the Maidan Revolution happened is because, there was this opposition in Russia to Ukraine entering into an association agreement with the EU. So if Russia consents to Ukraine actually joining the EU itself, like that's a kind of progress for Ukraine. Obviously, their country's been devastated; they're in a terrible situation. But that's not nothing, is what I'm saying. They'll also get some things that I don't really understand, honestly, like navigation rights in the Dnieper River. I don't really know, like what all is happening there, how significant that is. It sounds fairly significant, and then some vague commitment for the U.S., I guess, to give economic assistance for post-war rebuilding. So those are the terms of the deal as we understand them. I'm personally pretty satisfied with Trump's Russia-Ukraine diplomacy. I think I have mostly positive things to say about how the administration is handling this. But Joseph, what's your take on this situation?
I mean, I think it's about as good of a deal as the Ukrainians can expect to get, um, given that the war has not been going their way for the past year and a half, 2 years. Um, then it's going to be mighty difficult for them to get much better terms, especially with the prospect of the United States ceasing assistance and ceasing potential, negotiation or mediation of a peace settlement and negotiations with the Russians. So, and I mean, as far as the question of what Ukraine gets out of it, I mean, the most obvious thing is they're not at war anymore. Like, eventually, you have to come to terms with the fact that if you're losing a war, which Ukrainians have been, you have to find a way to stop it and to cut your losses. And the best peace deal is going to be the one in which you lose the least. So, when we're talking about the benefits of the peace deal for Ukraine, we have to be thinking about it from that perspective. Because really, it was always going to be an uphill battle for them. Russia's a much larger country, it has a much larger base for manpower. It has the tacit assistance of China, which is a major industrial power. And so, you know, even if the United States was willing to throw a lot more money into the Ukraine war than we did, was always going to be a long pull because money can't buy everything. It certainly can't buy manpower, which seems to be the main issue that the Ukrainians are really running into. You can't just drain your entire population pyramid to fight a war. Eventually, you'll run out and you'll have to stop. So that is, I think, the main thing that a lot of people are going to be up in arms with. And so I think it's just going to take a readjustment in attitudes, simply because this is the kind of thing that we haven't experienced a real kind of just sort of territorial expansionist war in a long time. That's not been a thing really since World War II. And so people are going to have to figure out, like, oh, this is actually how these kinds of conflicts are adjudicated. Sometimes people will win and other people will lose, and you'll have to adjust borders and adjust the political system in accordance.
Yeah, I think I agree with that totally. And I think people who are complaining about this deal, they should ask, well, could Ukraine have gotten a better deal on its own vis-a-vis Russia? Could it have gotten a better deal with the Ukraine, with the Europeans on its side pushing for it? Could it have gotten a better deal under Joe Biden? I mean, maybe in the latter case, in some abstract sense, it could have if Biden was like doing diplomacy, but also applying these sticks and these carrots in the smart way. But he wasn't doing that. He wasn't even talking to the Russians. So I don't think he could get the Russians to agree to a deal that would be better for Ukraine than what Trump is offering. I mean, I don't want to speak too soon. Moscow hasn't agreed to this deal either. But it does seem to me that you're basically right, Joseph. Ukraine is a much smaller country. Russia has these huge advantages on the battlefield. Russia is much less dependent on other countries for its weapons, and yet it also has these powerful countries that are helping it with weapons, or at least with industrial supplies, as in the case of China. And it's a grim situation for Ukraine. I want to ask Jude. Uh, I think that this might be a little difficult to stomach for Westerners because in part because the Biden administration it was so gung ho about the war. I think a lot of people had this impression that it wouldn't come to this, and there might be some surprise and disappointment that basically Russia's going to get territory through force. Do you think that there's going to be any political blowback against Trump in domestic politics coming out of this?
It's not terribly clear to me. I tend to think there's a little bit of a wash insofar as there are people who are, emotionally invested in the Ukrainian cause in the US, but there are also people who are emotionally invested in reducing American entanglements abroad. Um, I think that there is also just a real sense that Trump has a goal and is pursuing it in a way that Biden was not necessarily. Um, we had this open ended commitment to Ukraine, but then also we would place limits on how they could use weapons that we sent them. There were certain lines that we weren't willing to cross at this or that juncture. So I think that Trump comes out of it looking pretty good. I think that the fact that Ukrainian domestic opinion also favors a peace deal, uh, if the administration can amplify that, we have done what the Ukrainian people want, broadly speaking. I tend to think that this is more of a win than a loss. I think that the possible political danger is the sort of unrepentant war hawk elements within Trump's own coalition who are there. There are still hardline pro Ukrainian Republicans, especially in the legislature. Um, and they already don't like him for a bunch of things that he's doing. So I think that the question is how much political capital does he burn on this and how does that affect peacemaking with Iran, how does it affect his economic program? But on the whole, I think that it's more of a win than a loss, probably.
Yeah, I want to add to this point that you made about Ukrainian public opinion. People should go look at this November 2024 Gallup report where they did a survey in Ukraine. And even then, a majority of Ukrainians, a slim majority of Ukrainians, favored negotiations ASAP to end the war rather than continuing to fight in hopes of victory. Of the people who favored ASAP negotiations, most of them said they were open to territorial concessions to Russia. And if you look at the trend lines from that report, because Gallup had done a similar ones in 2023, so we could get a sense of how Ukrainian opinion was changing over time. If you look at it, it's pretty clear that those numbers are probably even higher today. Like they were trending in that direction. And we should also remember the context of that is like wartime dictatorship. you know, Zelensky's been called a dictator. I kind of think it's sort of true in the Roman sense. Like you need to have a strong executive to lead a war, to lead your country during a war. And it has involved getting rid of opposition parties. It's involved exerting control over the media, and that's intended to influence public opinion to be more pro-war. So Ukrainians were turning against the war even in that context, and I imagine fairly high majority of them now would support not only negotiations as soon as possible, but would be open to territorial concessions. I want to plug a piece of mine that went out today. It's called Trump's Russia-Ukraine Diplomacy is Working. I kind of lay out why I think you know, the progress that we've seen this week is largely attributable to the way his administration has handled this. One point that I make is that, Trump last week and Marco Rubio as well, they said on Friday, we're going to walk away from this thing if a deal isn't reached soon or if a deal seems like it's not going to be forthcoming. And I think that spurred some action on both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. Putin obviously declared the ceasefire and insisted that Ukraine mirror the actions or reciprocate this military pause. Maybe he also had some pressure on him from the Orthodox Church to do that, but the timing of it suggests to me that that he was signaling to Trump that he wants the U.S. to remain involved in peace negotiations, which I find really interesting because a lot of people are thinking he's just trying to wait out the Trump administration so that when it pulls back support, he'll intensify the war effort. I think he sees that the Trump administration can give him this kind of broader rapprochement with the U.S., and that if he doesn't resolve the war diplomatically, the Ukraine war, he's going to miss an opportunity for some bigger diplomatic achievement. And so I think Trump did a good job of putting that on the table because Biden definitely wasn't doing that. So that's one reason I think Trump has handled this basically well. I've been critical of Trump on immigration and tariffs and foreign policy stuff. But on Russia, Ukraine, I think that this is basically it's exceeded my expectations. And my expectations were fairly high. I thought that he would be better than Kamala by a long shot on Russia, Ukraine. But Joseph, do you want to have the last word on this topic before we move on?
I mean, sure. I think that at this point it really does come down to the Russian side. That is, in my opinion, is always going to be the hard part. The Russians are the people who have the upper hand in the war, um, and they are the side that Trump doesn't really have a lot of leverage over. Uh, the United States can exert quite a bit of leverage on Zelensky and the Ukrainians because we've been supporting them so far. Um, for internal politics, the president has a lot of levers that he can pull to deal with opposition internally from the Republican Party. But there's not a lot of leverage that he has on Putin. The Russian economy has already been sanctioned. The U.S. is already materially aiding Ukraine with their war effort. And so, if Putin doesn't decide to come around, or ultimately decides that the deal isn't convincing enough for him to want to wrap up the war the way the way that it stands, there's not going to be a lot that Trump can do. And so, that I think is going to be the really big question.
Yeah, well said. So let's go ahead and talk about Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and the apparent chaos that the Pentagon has fallen into under his leadership. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz got most of the blowback after the first signal snafu controversy. when Waltz inadvertently invited Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic into a chat about the looming strikes on Yemen's Houthis. There's now another signal controversy, this time about Hegseth sharing sensitive information in a chat that was also, I think, about striking the Houthis. I mean, this chat involved members of his own family, his wife and his brother. It also involved his personal lawyer. Uh, these are not people who should have access to sensitive information, it seems, but we don't know in this case exactly what information was conveyed, to my understanding. But what's getting even more attention is this kind of knife fight that seems to be going on in the Pentagon behind the scenes. Um, Hegseth's advisors and underlings have been engaged in power plays, it seems. It's a little mysterious to me what all's going on, but according to recent reports, Hegseth was getting paranoid about these suspected leaks. His outgoing chief of staff, Joe Casper, had reportedly created this kind of toxic workplace and was part of these moves behind the scenes to get more power within the Pentagon. And Casper played a role in pushing fairly high ranking officials, including Dan Caldwell, out of their jobs, supposedly over suspicions that they were involved in the leaks. Although Caldwell apparently wasn't given a polygraph test, as I understand, which suggests that he wasn't actually investigated for the leaks, because we had learned previously that there was this leak investigation and people were getting polygraph tests if they were suspects. We're not even really sure what those leaks relate to. Some people speculate that one of them has to do with this report that appeared, I believe, in the New York Times about Elon Musk getting some sort of report on possible military action against China. Um, there's also there was also this report that the strikes on Yemen's Houthis weren't working. That it was costing like $1 billion or more, pretty swiftly, soon into the operation, but without being very effective. So that's another story that people suspect might be related to these leaks, alleged leaks in the Pentagon, but I'm not sure. Caldwell went on the Carlson show to give his side of the story. I thought he made some very reasonable points about U.S. foreign policy, so I'm disappointed that his voice will no longer be heard inside the Pentagon. Jude, are there any details you want to fill in, and what do you think about all this?
Sure, I can just give some color commentary here. The This implosion has been pretty sudden. I think that a lot of us who watched the Pentagon from the outside were sort of surprised at how quickly it went pear shaped. Um, the It does seem that it does seem as if much of the problem arises from the fact that Hegseth is not a natural administrator and has not been really in a position where he has to handle something the size of the Pentagon and full of as many conflicting interests as the Pentagon is. Uh, and that he's been, relying on this inner circle, including family members, to do his job, which is sympathetic enough, up to a point, I think. Um, I do think that it is surprising how quickly he appears to have thrown Caldwell, Carroll, and Selnick under the bus. Uh, those were guys who had worked with him previously at other organizations. They were brought in as his people. Uh, and it sort of seems like the chief of staff, who is also his guy, didn't like them, and is out for bang for blood. So
And
I found
that's
that
Casper, right?
yes. So I found that a little bit surprising. Um, I think that it is fair to say that the Pentagon is in chaos right now. I think that it is not unreasonable to say that Hegseth probably has an expiration date at this point. Uh, it's not an original insight, but it has been noted that the president does not want to be seen caving to especially mainstream press pressure. So he's not going to fire Pete in a way that makes it look as if he's, you know, giving the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Atlantic or whoever a scalp. But it is also true that in the Trump show there is one show and it is Trump, and people who are cultivating sideshows, especially extremely negative sideshows, tend to head to the exit sooner rather than later. Uh, as to, I do think that it's worth, just talking a little bit about the substantive allegations to the degree that we have any right now. Um, it is just there's sort of a widespread misconception about leaking. Uh, Leaking is part of government communications. Leaking is how an administration gets stories to the press with the framing that it wants. Uh, it's why all three of us on this podcast have jobs. So the you know, just sort of waving the bloody shirt and saying, "Oh, we caught somebody who is leaking," uh, is not necessarily actually an interesting gotcha. Were they leaking with tacit or explicit permission of their superiors? Were they leaking to score political points against other people within their agency or department? Um, were they leaking to friendly outlets or unfriendly outlets? These are all questions you have to consider. But the accusation of leaking per se uh, is not hugely interesting. You can't share national secrets; that's against the law. Uh, but you know, especially for some of this stuff, it's information that was functionally publicly available. One of the things that is mentioned as the contents of one of the alleged leaks has to do with carrier group movements in the Persian Gulf area. Well, there are like 30 Twitter accounts that just follow satellite imaging and tell you where the carriers are going at a given time. So
Mm.
I think these are all worth considering when you are presented with the accusation so and so is a leaker. Uh, maybe, maybe not. Uh, but if they were leaking, why were they doing it? Were they being told to do it? So on.
Yeah, I can think of at least one other big reason that the focus on leaking is kind of strange in this instance, but maybe I'll save that. Joseph, what do you think of all this?
Sure, I think it's relatively unsurprising that Hegseth is the main thing the episode really shows is that Hegseth has been very reliant on outside counsel for running the Pentagon, which I think is very unsurprising. It's exactly what you would expect for someone who wasn't a staff officer, who came in essentially as an outsider. He's going to need a lot of help. The Pentagon is the biggest bureaucracy potentially in the world. It is a massive enterprise to run. And so you need people who know the ropes. You're going to need insiders who understand how the Pentagon works and uh, who has the power and who has the influence inside of the bureaucracy. You're going to need people who know the procedures and who are able to get your people where they need to go if you're going to be able to actually do your job. And so uh, that is not surprising. The big question for Hegseth was whether he was going to be able to manage those people. That was going to be the big test for him, and he has not done that successfully so far.
Yeah, as far as I want to respond to some of that, but on this leaking thing, one weird thing about this is Hegseth was sharing highly sensitive national security information in the Signal chat that Jeffrey Goldberg had been inadvertently invited into, and so it's just strange that he's kind of coming out and saying these people on my staff were leaking, and that's bad for the United States and bad for the Trump administration. I think it just doesn't play well with the public at the very least. Like it kind of invites a skeptical reaction. I think people can see that there's some sort of weird infighting going on. I'll say, Joseph, you said this was kind of predictable that Hegseth would eventually have trouble in this role because of the, you know, massive size of the Pentagon bureaucracy and his lack of experience in managing a large bureaucracy or a large staff of any kind. Um, I have to say, I was wrong about this. I thought that it would be basically fine for Trump to just put a handsome face at the top of the Pentagon, a total loyalist, and then just let the people around him, the like undersecretaries of policy, kind of run the show. I kind of thought it would work, and then Trump would be able to say, "Okay, Hegseth, fire this person or do this thing," and Hegseth would just have the authority to do what Trump wanted. Obviously, it hasn't worked out that way. It seems like Hegseth is indeed losing control, as many people, but not me, predicted. Um, and as far as how I feel about Hegseth in general, one thing that I've felt the past couple months is I didn't really understand why people who advocated foreign policy restraint seemed to like him. Like, I wasn't convinced that he was on our side, so to speak. Like, if you read his book, he comes across as this like crusader, like this very militaristic person who frankly like has a certain affection for Israel that makes him want to take out like Islamic countries. And I was worried about that. He claims to be a recovering neocon. He definitely was a neoconservative at one point. He does have experience in the war and in the military, in the war on terrorism, I mean, that plausibly, made him change his opinions on things. I know that he's frustrated with how veterans are treated and how soldiers are treated. They're sent to do these impossible tasks, and then they're held to account when things go wrong, while the civilian leadership kind of gets away with it. So I can kind of respect his perspective on that, though maybe not in every detail. I know he's defended some actors that sound pretty unsavory to me who have allegedly committed war crimes or who have been convicted of doing so. So I never really understood why he was, as I said, why people restrainers were fond of him. Although it is worth noting that on Iran, it seems like he was on the pro restraint camp, like J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, Steve Witkoff, and Pete Hegseth want to get a deal with Iran rather than a war. So if he is about to leave the administration, and if Trump wants to wait a little while so it doesn't seem like the media got a scalp, I hope they get a deal with Iran first, and then Hegseth departs, because who knows who his replacement is going to be? Is it going to be Tom Cotton? That's like the worst imaginable replacement. And if that happens, we're not going to get an Iran deal probably, or there's going to be a renewed, intensified push to sabotage it, I predict. Um, Jude, any other words on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with Hegseth, there are a couple factors for restrainers' affinity. One is that my understanding is he is personal friends with J.D. Vance, who is the most high-profile avatar of realism and restraint in the White House right now. He did run Concerned Veterans for America, which is an organization that is broadly sympathetic to the restraint and realism crowd. Um, I think also the fact that he was an outsider was extremely appealing. If you put another general in there, the feeling, I think, or the logic generally goes, you're going to have somebody who wants to just keep feeding the war machine, somebody who is a creature of the war machine. And if you have a guy who has no real pre-existing connection to the sort of organization side of warfare in America, you're much more likely to get someone who is going to take on serious reforms at the Pentagon. But the other side of that is that if you were going in and basically conducting a hostile occupation of a massive organization, you have to be good. You have to be
Mm-hmm.
competent. Um, and it's not clear at this juncture that Pete Hegseth was that guy.
I think the big thing is, like, when you're trying to do something of this scale, uh, you have to be a really, really good judge of character, and you have to be really, really good at managing the people that you're going to be relying on who know how things work inside the Pentagon, and being able to keep them in line. Um, and that's a skill all on its own, and I mean, it's gonna be hard to find somebody like that, but I think it's pretty clear at this point that Hegseth does not have that skill. And so that's probably the biggest reason why he's probably not going to last very long, is because even if we manage to tamp down this particular outbreak of problems, the the fundamental reason that they started in the first place is still going to be there, and there's no reason to expect that you're not just going to be kicking the can down the line and ending up with a bigger blow up later.
Right. It's worth emphasizing that the guys who got fired were Hegseth's guys. We're not
Hmm.
talking about career people who are being obstructionist. These are people Hegseth brought in, some of whom he had worked with before, to be his, consigliere and copy within the organization. And, those are the guys who got frog marched out of the Pentagon.
Yeah, and Dan Caldwell was really seen as this like rising figure in the military community. I hope this doesn't kind of screw up his career prospects going forward, like in terms of reputational damage, because he's great. Like people should go listen to that Tucker Carlson interview. He doesn't actually reveal that much about what's going on because he's like a respectful guy and he doesn't want to just be like airing people's dirty laundry, or revealing things that Hegseth would rather keep secret. But when he's talking about foreign policy, I really get the sense that he's exactly the kind of person that I want at the Pentagon. He's exactly the kind of person who I want, whispering in Hegseth's ear. At one point, he was talking about this alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And he said, this is not a natural alliance. And the only reason that these countries are getting closer together is because of US policy, and specifically Biden's democracy versus autocracy crusade, which just became this self fulfilling prophecy where all of these autocratic countries started to think, what's the US up to? It seems to be building some sort of coalition against us. So probably we should band together in self defense, and the result is, Russia and China they're sticking together. And probably at this moment in history, we would like to peel Russia away because China is the pure competitor. Biden made that a lot more difficult. Caldwell seems to totally understand this kind of dynamic, and it's precisely the kind of dynamic that military professionals often don't understand. So I'm very disappointed to see him gone. He's a pro-restraint person. I don't think all the people fired were. Initially, when the story broke, there was this perception that this infighting was ideologically driven, that there were these competing ideological factions, and that the restrainers were losing. It seems now like what's going on behind the scenes is much more personal rather than ideological. But nevertheless, I think it's a loss for restrainers just because Caldwell is gone.
And that's, if anything, even more an indictment of the state of affairs at the War Department. If the deep state was pushing people out, that's one thing. But if, it's just the fact that nobody can get along, then that just means, the management's not doing their job. Like, that's your number one job as manager, is to ensure that your employees are able to get along well enough to do the jobs that they need to do, while and instead of being at each other's throats, stepping on each other's toes.
Yeah. I wonder how Hegseth should handle this in terms of PR. His obvious strategy is to just be really aggressive in his response. Like when he's asked by the media about what's going on, he talks about the fake news and the hoax media and all of these like disloyal people who are trying to sabotage the administration through leaks and by, spreading bad stories in the mainstream media, stories which are false. I think that a lot of Republicans kind of take their cues from Trump because this is his tendency, but it doesn't really work as well as it does with Trump because Trump is sort of unique in not really holding a grudge, not really taking this stuff personally, being kind of funny, and almost self-deprecating in how hyperbolic he can be. I mean, maybe that's a stretch, but like I think it kind of works in Trump's case to take this stance, and Americans kind of accept this feature of Trump's personality and see it as a form of strength. But in Hegseth's case, I think it's not really working, and it's kind of making him seem erratic
It
and
just
not
looks
like
like
a
bluster
leader.
for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, Jude, any last words before we ask you about the Pope? And if you don't have last words, go ahead and fill us in on Pope Francis and what's going on in the Catholic Church.
Okay. I don't have any last words, so I guess I'll talk about the late Pope. So, for our listeners who are unfamiliar, the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. and the one we've just had for 12 years kicked the bucket, Pope Francis. He is a controversial figure for a variety of reasons. Um, he was perceived as a break from the conservative friendly papacies that preceded him, the 5 year papacy of Pope Benedict XVI, who died about 2 years ago now, after retiring in 2005. And not 2005, 2013. And then Pope John Paul II, who was Pope for ages and ages and ages. The A lot has been said about Francis. I'm not sure that it's terribly fruitful for me to expatiate at length. I said in my obituary, the sort of ideological readings of Francis kind of miss the point. Pope Francis, above all in his administration, was about centralizing power in his own person. The sort of constant organizational chaos he kept the church in, with his constant reconstitutions of the way the Roman Curia especially works, but also the way that Rome relates to the bishops, meant that he was sort of there was no ability for the institutions themselves, or the people within the institutions, to build power separate from him. He was the ultimate arbiter. You see this in a lot of the things that he did that traditional Catholics did not like. But you also see it in things that were broadly friendly to traditional Catholics. He would do it if it made him more powerful. While this may be a good way to run an organization if your goal is to acquire and hold on to power, it's not actually a great way to foster stability or solvency. The sort of background condition that is going to underrate the conclave that will elect the next pope sometime in the next month is the fact that the Vatican is almost broke, and is, on the financial side, very compromised, both by the fact that it's broke and the fact that it's fairly corrupt. The last guy who was tasked with auditing the Vatican was shipped back to where he came from on a spurious lawsuit, and then mysteriously died while undergoing a routine surgery. So I would advise all of our listeners to avoid taking the task of auditing the Vatican if you can avoid it. One of the aspects, so what sort of lies before us is this prospect of uncertainty and chaos. There are no sort of pre-existing structures to determine who the next guy is going to be, or what the next, however long trajectory is going to be. This is what happens when you have a sort of heroic figure die, the guy that it's all sitting on. Everybody has to scramble very, very quickly to identify their interests, make allies, and figure out, how to cut deals with everyone else. So I think that the conclave will be surprising no matter what happens. If any of our listeners are betting men or women, right now, Cardinal Parolin, who is the Vatican Secretary of State, is trading at 30%. It's not going to be him because he brokered a catastrophic deal with the Chinese Communist Party, that was pretty much a failure along every metric. So if you want to make a quick 30% return, go buy some shares of Cardinal Parolin on Polymarket right now. So yeah, that's sort of my word vomit on the church, the state of the church, Francis, and what comes next.
Nice. Yeah, I'll just say I really admired how Pope Francis participated in these Easter festivities despite being gravely ill, and apparently his doctors advising him he absolutely should stay in bed and rest. You know, he was in the Pope Mobile and, waving at people, the Easter crowds. Met with JD Vance one day before his death, right? Um, so
Unrelated.
there's, yeah, unrelated. So that's admirable. Like, I found a lot about him admirable, and he's perceived to be this progressive liberal. I think that pertains exclusively to the issue of mass migration because he's pretty traditional on other issues, unless I'm mistaken. Jude, for
He
the
really,
podcast listeners on podcast apps, Jude waved his hand to say sort of half and half, correct?
yeah. I mean, so there was a lot of sort of dancing around LGBTQ, etc. issues while he was Pope. He said a lot of things that were kind of apparently softening the church's position on homosexuality in particular, while at the same time he compared gender theory to nuclear weapons. So cash that out as you will.
He also said some very
He
amusing things about
also,
Italian seminaries, if I recall correctly.
yes, he had, even as this sort of apparent softening was going on in some of his statements, in other statements, he sort of evinced the attitudes of an 85-year-old Italian Argentinian man regarding people of that persuasion. So that's one aspect. Uh, the other aspect is that he did have a strong antipathy towards the traditional mass, which is a relatively niche issue, even within the church. He made it a much bigger issue by devoting so much time and attention to it. Why did he do this? First off, as a centralization of power thing, I do think. He did not want there to be a traditionalist clique that was building its own structures and its own networks that he did not have control over. And I think also the fact that moves against traditionalists and conservatives more broadly tend to strike against the Catholic Church in America disproportionately. The American church is large, it is relatively wealthy, it is relatively conservative compared to the European church. And, you know, the Pope also, frankly, just doesn't like Americans that much. He's a pretty standard Italian Argentinian man of the age of 85 in certain respects. So, so these are the things that fed this narrative of the Pope as liberal or progressive, along with the things that every Pope says, like, war is bad. Maybe the Israel Gaza war should get wrapped up. Maybe the Ukraine Russia war should get wrapped up. That manner of things. So uh, it evinces a certain sort of provincialism on the part of the American commentariat, that they are trying to stuff the Pope into a Republican or a Democrat box.
Hmm.
But it's not completely sort of unfounded. It's not like there wasn't stuff there for them to say, oh, look, he's dealing out licks to our side, and run with.
Interesting. I think we can go ahead and go to our picks of the week, where we each select one article from the American Conservative over the past 7 days that we want to highlight. Joseph, what's yours this week?
Sure. So I wanted to choose Adam Johnston's piece about titled "Ending the China Paradox." It's great. It points to something that I have also liked to point out, which is the fact that you, if there's a certain paradox involved in American foreign policy, which is that if you want the U.S. to be assertive on the world stage, uh, That comes backed up by hard power by ships and shells, which means you need an industrial base for your military. Uh, and on the other hand, uh, if you want to withdraw, if you want to be more restrained, you don't need as much of a military industrial base. Uh, but that axis seems to be largely untouched in modern American politics. A lot of the people who are very strongly for more American interventionism oppose any measures that would lead to a stronger military industrial base for the United States. Good piece, Ending the China Paradox by Adam Johnston.
Jude?
Sure. This morning we published Jim Antle's column, Amid the Pentagon Pandemonium, Personnel is Policy. Great headline. Whoever the managing editor was who wrote that really hated the piece this morning. But it's basically just sort of an outline of what's going on with the Hegseth debacle and what the implications are within the administration and within the United States at large. So, Jim Antle, Amid the Pentagon Pandemonium, Personnel is Policy.
And I'm going to pick Ecuador's Bukele is his own man, which the senior editor wrote that title, I believe, and it's a good one. And this is by, what's his name? Last name Gonzalez Galarza. I apologize for not remembering the first name. And I found this piece pretty interesting, very informative. It's about Ecuador's young, popular president who apparently, as I learned from the article, people in America have difficulty locating ideologically. It seems like the thing that people are saying about him now is that he's kind of taking his cues from Bukele in El Salvador and taking a hard stance on crime. And this piece just kind of goes through sort of the politics of Ecuador and what their president, who I think his name is pronounced Daniel Noboa. Is that right, Joseph?
Noboa, yeah.
Noboa. It's about what his power base is, what politics are like in Ecuador, how he's kind of navigated a difficult political situation to become a pretty popular president, as I understand, but also what his political challenges are going forward. It's an informative read about a country that I don't know much about, so that's why I picked it. And that brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you to our listeners for sticking around till the end, and thank you, Jude and Joseph, for the great conversation. See you next time.